Hegel failed to find absolute knowledge. The evil 20th century critical theorist Habermas wrote a book called The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. He gets into the 1800s continental idealist philosopher Hegel's thoughts on reason and faith. Remember that professional mangler philosophy James Lindsay strawmans Habermas and misinterprets Hegel. My favorite Lacanian slash Marxist philosopher Slavoj Zizek is a fan of Hegel and has mixed opinions about Habermas. The critical theorists in the infamous 1900s Frankfurt School are often blamed as the criminal masterminds behind so called postmodernism. This is in spite of the fact that critical theorists usually don't deconstruct Enlightenment institutions and language as 70s post structuralists like Foucault and Derrida do. Critical theorists are also different from classic Marxists, such as Marx, Engels, and Trotsky, in that they examine the cultural and aesthetic remnants of fascism in post World War II society. Postmodernism is actually post structuralism, basically. Famous former clinical psychologist and professional pseudo intellectual crackpot Jordan Peterson endlessly strawmans so called postmodernists such as Derrida and Foucault. Anyway, like I said, in the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, Habermas gets into Hegel's perspective on faith and reason. Remember that I've also been explaining some ideas of Kant and Fichte in my series on the Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and my series on Zizek's book called Less Than Nothing. Kant was a famous 1700s Enlightenment philosopher. Fichte was one of the founders of German idealism in the 1700s. Remember that Hegel was also an idealist. Habermas points out that in 1802, Hegel dealt with Kant and Fichte's philosophical systems. He approached this from a perspective of there being an antithesis between faith and knowledge. Remember from my series on Less Than Nothing that Fichte criticizes Hegel's supposed system of absolute knowledge. Hegel's is based on a philosophy of the subject, while Fichte's system is based on a philosophy of subjectivity. The goal behind Hegel's vantage point from an assumed opposition between faith and knowledge is to destroy the philosophy of subjectivity from within. Habermas thinks that Hegel didn't explore this idea vigorously enough. To him, Hegel's problem was relying on a flawed diagnosis of the Age of Enlightenment. He used this to presuppose the absolute. Due to Hegel's flawed diagnosis of the Enlightenment, his destruction of Fichte's philosophy of subjectivity didn't work. Hegel's mistake is also why his system of absolute knowledge, based on the philosophy of the subject, fails. It stands on a broken foundation. In Hegel's system, he presents reason as having the power to unify both knowledge and faith. To him, we can arrive at absolute knowledge through the philosophy of the subject by using reason to reconcile the false dichotomy between faith and knowledge. Remember, Richard Rorty and Gianni Vattimo point this out in their book. What's it called? But they're talking about the fact that actually they talk about a false dichotomy between faith and science. But anyway, a false dichotomy between faith and knowledge. But since Hegel's philosophy of the subject and supposed dismantling of subjectivity relies on using reason to unite faith and knowledge, does this make faith and knowledge irreconcilable? If his system of absolute knowledge based on the philosophy of the subject fails, it seems impossible to unify knowledge and faith with reason in order to achieve absolute knowledge. So, Habermas explored Hegel's thoughts on faith and reason in the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. James Lindsay's favorite critical theorist to strawman is Habermas. Well, his favorite continental philosopher to misinterpret is Hegel. Zizek has different opinions on both Habermas and Hegel. He agrees and disagrees with some of both their ideas. One thing for sure is that the critical theorists like Habermas are not the supervillains behind so called fucking postmodernism. Post structuralists like Foucault and Derrida are very different from critical theorists, even though there are some similarities. Both post structuralists and critical theorists also study different subjects and have different perspectives from classic Marxists. especially Foucault and Derrida. They're even less similar than the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School. Derrida and Foucault are Jordan Peterson's favorite so-called postmodernist to straw man, as everyone knows. So I've discussed the Enlightenment philosopher Kant and the founder of the German idealism that Hegel followed by that was founded by Fichte. Habermas points out that Hegel supposedly dismantled Kant and Fichte's philosophical systems with a particular assumption. This was that there's an inherent opposition between faith and knowledge. Hegel's system of absolute knowledge is based on a philosophy of the subject, and Fichte's system is based on a philosophy of subjectivity. Hegel insists that there is an antithesis between faith and knowledge so that he can destroy the philosophy of subjectivity from within and verify his philosophy of the subject. Habermas thinks that Hegel should have delved more deeply into this argument. Apparently, relying on a flawed diagnosis of the Enlightenment was Hegel's real problem. He used his flawed diagnosis to presuppose his system of absolute knowledge based on a philosophy of the subject. This meant that Fichte's philosophical system, based on subjectivity, was still standing because Hegel's flawed diagnosis of the Enlightenment failed to destroy it. This also means that to Habermas, Hegel's strategy backfired by unintentionally proving Fichte right while destroying his own theory from within instead. Hegel's system, based on a philosophy of the subject, supposedly confirms the assertion that absolute knowledge can be reached by using reason to unify faith and knowledge. However, since Habermas points out that Hegel's system fails, doesn't this mean that we cannot actually use reason to unite faith and knowledge? Doesn't this make absolute knowledge impossible? If we agree that we cannot get there by using a philosophy of the subject to unify faith and knowledge, this means that the wall between faith and knowledge can never be broken down. It seems like Habermas is implying that this means absolute knowledge is impossible because Hegel's argument doesn't work. Hegel failed to find absolute knowledge.